Hi, and welcome to another Sexual Citizens micro lecture. This micro lecture is on power and beyond. Before we begin, a content warning. As in the book, we describe sexual assaults in this lecture as students recounted them to us. This material can be hard to hear. It was hard for us to hear, and of course, harder even for many of the students to experience. If you need to take a break while listening, please do so. If you want to call, the RAIN hotline is 1-800-656-HOPE. That's 1-800-656-4673. Please know that you're never alone. So in Sexual Citizens, we build off a classic approach to understanding sexual assault. That approach is gender and power. And Jennifer and I build off this because we think that there's a lot that's right about that approach. There's a lot that's right about understanding the gender dynamics that are important for explaining sexual assault, and that central to those gender dynamics are power disparities or differences in the amount of power that people have. But if sexual assault is about power, we also need to recognize that there are many power inequalities on campus. There are many power inequalities that aren't just about gender. So as we've said in other lectures and we note in the book, every single Black woman that we spoke to told us a story of unwanted sexualized touching. Every single one. Black men similarly told us stories about how, at parties, women walked up to them and grabbed their penises. This experience is about race and a denial of Black people's corporeal autonomy. Or another way of thinking about this is that we can't explain this just through the lens of gender. The fact that white students viewed the bodies of their Black colleagues and fellow classmates as available to them is part of viewing Blacks as not having an equal right to self-determination. That is an expression of racism, not just an expression of gender inequality. And so in the book, Jennifer and I argue that we need to attend to the multiple intersecting power inequalities on campus. We need to think about how gender deeply influences sexual assault, but that how race also does, and so does social class, so does sexuality, so does nationality, ability, and so many other power inequalities. We say here intersecting power inequalities, and that concept of intersectionality comes from Kimberly Crenshaw. And Kimberly Crenshaw is a Black feminist scholar who noted that often within the gender literature, people, when they talked about women, basically were talking about white women and were assuming that the experience of white women was equivalent to the experience of all other women. But Crenshaw noted that the experience of Black women was different than the experience of white women. And so you couldn't simply talk about women's experiences because of the ways that gender intersected with race. And this has led to an explosion of scholarship that pushes us to think about how it is that different power inequalities intersect with one another. Or how to talk about gender, you also have to think about race. How to talk about class, you also have to think about sexuality, and how all of these power inequalities intersect or overlap with one another. Now, in the book, the way that we write the book is to talk about all of these things together in stories after story after story in dialogue with one another. And although we don't go into this explicitly in the book, one way that we build upon the work of intersectionality is by combining it with the anthropological idea of studying up. That is, of studying power by also looking at the experiences of those with more power. In Sexual Citizens, this means looking at men's experiences in relationship to whiteness, wealth, heterosexuality, cisnormativity, rather than just looking at them as men. So for example, in our chapter on the toxic brew, we explore the relationship between masculinity, whiteness, wealth, heterosexuality as intersecting forms of power. This helps us provide an intersectional analysis that brings in gender, but also goes beyond gender to think of multiple intersecting forms of power.
So Seamus has been talking about intersectionality as one of our main ways to thinking about power as a way of thinking about social power. And in the book, if the attention to social power is sort of the first overall approach that we have to power, there's also a second way that we suggest people should think about power, which is to be attentive to situational power. If social power is the kind of power that people have from their position within a status hierarchy because of the social position they inhabit, this can mean the power of whiteness or of age. Situational power is the power that people have because of the context they're in. So, for example, different rates of sobriety can result in different situational power, or different levels of sexual experience can result in different situational power. You could potentially accrue more sexual experience and go from being the less experienced person to the more experienced person. So situational power inequalities are ones where people could conceptually be on either side of that inequality. So as an example, Charlene was a genderqueer student from the Midwest who grew up in a family and a community that was not supportive of their gender identity. And they recounted to us how a summer theater program was the first space that they'd ever been in. It was, as they said, their first seeing of queerness. And it was the first time that they felt like they were surrounded by people that they could imagine a community that they fit into in a way that they had never had in high school. It was also a summer experience where they were assaulted. They were assaulted by an older gay man. They were drunk. The man was less drunk. And that assault, as we describe it in the book, there were differences that were both structural and situational. So differences in age, in intoxication, in sexual experience, in social support, but also in power. If you think about the advantage that an out gay man has compared to a genderqueer youth, you can see that even within the LGBT community, there are important differences in social power. Another thing to think about in the way that we approach power in Sexual Citizens is that students don't have to have power in order to use power. By implication, students who don't feel particularly powerful may still end up being able to exploit aspects of a situation to their advantage. One of the ways that we saw this in the book is the instances that we recount of women assaulting men. Boutros, for example, was a athletic, popular young man on campus who seemed socially advantaged in every way a man could be. And he recounted being assaulted. He was very uncomfortable using that label, but being sexually assaulted by a woman one night when he was visiting a friend in a city where he didn't really know the city. The woman was older. He was very drunk. He ended up in bed at her house just because he was too drunk to go anywhere else. And she sort of insisted that he come home with her. And he was so confused. He didn't even understand that women could assault men. And so he didn't really know what to think of it as it was happening. And he just kept saying to himself, like, "You're gross. What are you doing?" as she was grabbing at him. So that wasn't a situation. He was probably bigger than she was. He was a man. And so if the only way that you think about power is social power, you can't really understand the forms of power that his disorientation, her certainty about what she wanted, that led to that interaction. So a couple of take-homes. For students navigating sex on campus, there is a practical take-home for these ways of thinking about power, which is the importance of reflecting on their own power, both socially and situationally, and how having access to more power can put them in a position of inadvertently harming someone through sex. For those of us engaged with prevention, the implication is that we need to think more about, or keep thinking about policies and programs that could undermine or mitigate these socially organized inequalities and prepare people better to recognize those social power disparities. We also want to close, instead of tying this up in a neat bow and saying we've solved everything, we want to close by pointing to some of the loose ends in the book as an invitation to a new generation of scholarship. So this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end, because there are things that are not adequately explored in Sexual Citizens. We don't talk about disability. We didn't, because we were interested in examining the experience of the whole campus, we didn't dive deep into the important forms of heterogeneity that exist among Asians, both Asian Americans and Asian students from outside the United States. There's much more that could be said about the diversity among the queer community and the socially organized power differentials that exist there. And then international students. There's this funny concept in business that there's the US and then there's ROW, which stands for the rest of the world. And I think that when people talk about international student vulnerability, there's somehow the idea that like all students from outside the US are the same. And of course, that's absurd. And so, we would love to see work that looked in a much more granular way at the diversity of experiences of international students, many of whom were totally mystified by some of the American, by the socially produced ignorance around sexuality, by the American drinking culture. For some international students, coming to Morningside Heights meant moving into a vastly more open sexual society, and for some of them it meant moving into a vastly more uptight and mixed up sexual society. And so it's just a gesture in the end at saying that even though we do put forward these important and useful concepts, we're looking forward to seeing other people put the concepts into action and unpack them in other contexts. So thank you.